My father put the first tools in my hand when I was 5 years old. It was he who instilled a love of solving problems in me. My favorite activity as a child was to take apart furniture and put it back together again. As I grew up, my father taught me that it was important to find out why something was broken before fixing it. And it took me becoming a minister for me to understand the larger lesson he taught me. As many of you know, I began my Doctor of Ministry journey 2.5 years ago. Pandemic hobbies, am I right? Today's sermon is a bit of an overview of what I've been doing and what I learned and why I think it's important now. So, growing up, I was often chastised for asking too many questions, often by people who did not want to delve in too much into the why something was happening. They rarely stopped me because I understood that if I did not question things, I couldn't learn. And a lot of this questioning and learning led me along a very circuitous route to Unitarian Universalism. Looking back now, I see I needed lessons and tools from all the places I called spiritual homes. Now, when I was a kid, I attended a United Methodist church, and I delved all the way in. I took a year-long confirmation class before I was allowed to be called a member of the church. It's not exactly the words they use, but close enough. I truly knew what it meant to make that commitment to the church, what was expected of me, and what I could expect from the other people in the church. Many years later, decades later, when I joined my first Unitarian Universalist congregation, I remember being constantly surprised at the things that were deemed unnecessary. When I inquired about joining the church on my second visit, I was taken to the office to sign the membership book. I wasn't required to attend any membership classes, even though I had never attended a UU congregation before. As I was told, they reasoned that I had been a youth minister years before, so I knew what it meant to belong to a congregation. Even though that time was in the Assemblies of God Church, pretty much the complete opposite of Unitarian Universalism. Even when I asked about opportunities for faith formation, I was offered website links and access to the congregational library. That moment stuck with me as I finally answered the call to ministry and entered seminary. And after helping out at new member classes at different congregations, I discovered that everyone does it differently. One congregation offered 3 in-depth sessions, allowing potential new members a chance to meet the leadership and to get to know one another. Another congregation offered a 1 afternoon-long meeting where a brief history of the congregation, along with explanations of governance and activities, was all that was offered. Other congregations would offer a pre-made curriculum for new members, and yet others had a loose outline for structure. Now, since Unitarian Universalism is structured under congregational polity, each congregation sets its own standards for membership. So let me pause for a moment to explain congregational polity. It means that all power resides in the local congregation for that local church. In other words, as congregations, you would own your own property. The congregation selects and hires the minister, and you determine through your own bylaws what it means to be a member of this congregation. At other congregations, including the ones I serve, they may do things differently. And that's okay, because that's the beauty of congregational polity. We do what works for our community and our congregation. Now, the UUA may recommend best practices, but it is up to the vote of this congregation on how things for this congregation will go, just like it's up to the vote of every other UU congregation to determine how things go for those UU congregations in regards to ministry and membership. Now, this may not seem like a problem until people move to another city and find another UU congregation. Then conflicting information about what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist can lead to conflict. Now, this doctoral project came from my own wonderings as I virtually attended the Unitarian Universalist Association's General Assembly in 2019. I watched in awe and horror as arguments begin to bubble up about who we are and whom we include. Microaggressions turned into aggressions as a document was passed around that caused harm to BIPOC and LGBTQ+ Unitarian Universalists. The schisms we saw in our country then were beginning to fracture our denomination. Something was broken, and I needed to know why. I first began to wonder why there were so many conflicting statements on what it meant to be a Unitarian Universalist. For some, it was about intellectualism and individual freedom. For others, it was about living out our values in social action and justice. For even others, it was more about what we weren't than what we are about. There were as many descriptions of what it meant to be a member of a Unitarian Universalist congregation as there were members in the whole of the UUA. And as I began to preach on our denomination's history, I realized we were missing some basic understandings. This project grew out of that, wondering whether a lack of common foundational knowledge contributed to the strife. In the 2.5 years it took to create and implement my Doctor of Ministry project, the lines have become more staunchly drawn and at times more divisive and aggressive. My hope is this work I've done will help as a tool to let us begin at a common understanding of what it means to be a practicing Unitarian Universalist. To do the work we are called to do to create a just and equitable world, we must be grounded in our faith. So let's start with some basic understandings of who and where we are. Unitarian Universalism itself is a relatively newer denomination. In 1961, the Unitarian and the Universalist faith traditions merged to become the UUA, a, quote, voluntary association of autonomous, self-governing member congregations which have freely chosen to pursue common goals together. Congregations covenant to join the UUA and are certified as member congregations every year by holding regular religious services, maintaining and reporting membership numbers, holding an annual business meeting for the congregation, and making a financial contribution to the UUA. Once certified, each congregation has a certain number of delegates based on their membership size, along with any ministerial and professional religious education delegates. These delegates then vote in the annual General Assembly, where the association's business meeting occurs. Now, we are an aspirational faith, covenanting together to affirm and promote the 7 principles about who we will be both together in the world. And I know that we're changing to the Article 2, but this was written when we are still under the 7 principles at this point. These principles are printed at the beginning of our bylaws, inside the front cover of our hymnal, and many congregations print them in their bulletins and on the website. They're not a creed, and they are not a checklist. They are a continual aspiration for how we wish to be in the world. And we don't always get it right. Currently, we're looking at taking a hard look at our own inherent white supremacy culture within our association and how we have failed our siblings of color. The Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, the immediate past president of the UUA, says, quote, "We are called to put our values, our relationships, and all our spiritual resources to the work of wholeness. Together, imperfectly, we work to build communities and practices of inclusion, care, growth, and love." And while the work we do around anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multiculturalism is at the forefront of our social justice work and the work within our own communities, we are struggling. We should be a natural home for those who are spiritual but not religious, and yet Unitarian Universalism has not kept up with population growth. At the time of our merger in 1961, there were 1,035 churches with a membership of 229,103 people. 7 years after the merger, 1968, UU churches reached a peak with 1,135 churches and 282,307 members. However, in 1979, we were at our lowest with 988 churches and a little over 176,000 members. 3 years later, the number of churches increased to 999, but membership dropped to 171,000. Certification data for 2020 showed 1,027 churches and 187,000 members. While some decline in 2020 was expected due to the pandemic sending all the UUA congregations to virtual services, it is still part of the steady decline since 2012. But why? Well, one reason for this is the loss of our youth after reaching adulthood. The 2005 Commission on Appraisal reported that we lose around 85% of our youth. 85%. Now, this can be attributed to many reasons, but the one the commission lifted up is the lack of spiritual and theological conversations in the adult congregation. They said, quote, without a means of spiritual exploration through communities and practices, the church will continue to lose youth, young adults, and older adults who feel spiritually unfulfilled by standard UU fare. At the same time, UUs need to take a great care in administering and promoting such communities so as not to drive away those folks who see their UU congregation as their bastion of protection against these very things in the larger society. Now, besides the youth leaving, many adults who consider themselves spiritual but not religious are either not finding Unitarian Universalist congregations or are, and find them lacking spirituality. At the same time, while our principles state that we affirm and promote the, quote, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, that does not always bear out in practice. Individual congregational culture depends on what the majority of the congregation believes, whether that is theist or non-theist or somewhere in between. However, sometimes it's not the sheer numbers that tilt a congregation humanist or spiritual, but the beliefs of the more involved members with both time and donations. These members volunteer for committees which prepare worship and programming, thus keeping their belief system forefront. There needs to be a deeper understanding of our shared theology and meaning behind what we do, so that all are welcome at our table. Meg Riley states, quote, radical caring calls us to create truly inclusive congregations. Many Unitarian Universalists can name the time when, because of a deepening connection to our faith community, we were suddenly able to relax, to know that all our edges were accepted, that we did not have to choose which of our identities we could safely allow into the room. How do our congregations let people know that they are in such places, especially in today's landscape with its variety of cultures, languages, musical forms, metaphors, stories, political analyses, and other differences? Unitarian Universalists need to have a firm grounding in what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. And this includes our history as separate denominations before 1961 and our shared history since the merger. It includes both the good and the bad history around the white supremacy culture within and without our movement. It includes learning about and from the misogyny in our history. It also means learning about our theological history and how that brought us out of the Puritan Congregationalist churches and eventually to where we are today. We need to understand the why behind the what that we do. And we need to understand the diversity of beliefs within Unitarian Universalism. Paul Razor stated, quote, we cannot strengthen our prophetic practice unless we reclaim its religious dimensions. Our prophetic practice is rooted in the theological principles and mutual obligations that shape our covenant and define our shared faith tradition. We need to speak out, not simply as liberals, but as religious liberals, supporting liberal causes and taking liberal positions on political and social issues are not enough. We need to show that these positions are religiously grounded. We need to come out of our religious closets. Reclaiming our religious voice will strengthen our justice-making activities and help reestablish Unitarian Universalism's critical role in an era that badly needs it. So what did I learn? That was all my history and my research. What did I learn out of my project? Well, earlier this year, I taught a class, and it was pretty intense, and I'm appreciative of those from the congregation I serve who participated. This group of people committed to digging in and digging deep, and together we explored UU history, our shared theologies, spiritual practices, the concept of congregational polity, covenant, and the Cambridge platform, our principles and sources, and deeply discussed the Article 2 changes, and then had an in-depth conversation about membership. It was a lot, and yes, it will eventually be available, but let me defend and publish first. But let me share some learnings I gathered from that project. In the group discussion during the class about congregational polity and covenant, I asked the question, how does our covenant and congregational polity work together in our relationships here and in the wider UU community? And one participant responded, quote, congregational polity is about covenant. Common knowledge is that these are two separate things, but it's not. We can't do what we want because that's not what it's about. And that summed up that session pretty well, and the rest of the participants agreed. From the class on the principles and sources and various proposed changes, I asked, do you think it's important to look at our principles and sources every 10 years? And one participant said, quote, "As we bend the arc towards justice, we uncover more injustice. The dominant narrative shifts and changes." Another reflected, quote, "We learn things we may not have realized were offensive. As we learn and grow, we need to take a look again." Another participant commented on that statement and related about watching old comedy specials or movies and realizing that they no longer hold up. So what does it mean to be a practicing Unitarian Universalist? It means we know our history, the good, the bad, the ugly, the hard, and the beautiful. It means we look deeper than the feel-good legends and really look at what was going on in the time frame that it happened. It means we look at whose stories we aren't hearing. It means we understand that we do come out of traditions that had specific theologies. And it means that we understand that we are a pluralistic faith, knowing that there are many paths to someone's search for truth and meaning, and we work together to encourage each other to a free and responsible search for that. It means we remember that by whatever name we call it, we all need to participate in practices that sustain us in the long haul of the work towards justice. Some call them spiritual practices, some call them hobbies, some call them exercise, but regardless, they are needed to continue to sustain our hearts and minds and bodies and souls in this work. It means we understand that while we have a bunch of rights in congregational polity, we also have responsibilities to take care of one another, not just within these walls, virtual or brick and mortar, but between the other UU congregations. And sometimes that means calling them back to the larger covenant we say we agree to. Sometimes that means calling ourselves back to covenant. We are not lone islands out here in the world. We need one another, and we are supposed to help one another. It means that we understand what values and principles hold us together. We know that our tradition is a living one. Revelation is not sealed in Unitarian Universalism. We are constantly striving to learn more, and as we know better, we do better. And sometimes that hurts. And sometimes there is great beauty in the new growth that comes from it. We need to remember that the work we do here is all about creating beloved community out there. In here, we can get messy. We can make mistakes. But be clear, and hear me on this, we cannot leave our messes. Yes, we can be messy, and we need to clean up those messes when we make them. Beloveds, if we cannot figure out how to be a Unitarian Universalist in here, how can we ever hope to live it out in the world? The theology of covenant is a vital part of the Unitarian Universalist faith. It is tied into the principles Unitarian Universalist congregations covenant to affirm and promote as part of the UUA. However, the question is, do most UUs understand what covenant means? The Commission on Appraisal raises this question as well. Quote, "Many questions arise when we consider the relationship between mission and covenant. It might be important to first consider why we are together before deciding how we are to be together. That is, does covenant serve mission? What is the mission of the UU congregation and or the UU faith tradition? Are they the same? Who defines it or them? To what extent are our principles a mission statement mixed with elements of covenant, or a covenant mixed with elements of mission? Or are the principles a statement of shared values? Is our mission in the modern day world to explore how to promote the values of justice and wholeness in our lives, our faith communities, and the larger world?" That's the question I leave with you. What does it mean to you to be a practicing Unitarian Universalist? How does your understanding of covenant within this congregation and with the other congregations inform how you are in the world? Basically, why are you here? Not just here on Sundays. Why are you, Mosaic, here in this virtual space, in this time, and in your community? What does it mean to be a Unitarian Universalist now in 2023 in this society? How does your understanding of what it means to be a UU inform how you interact with the world today? While I've shared my learnings, these are things you need to figure out for your congregation and for yourself. It is with that understanding that we can be practicing Unitarian Universalists, living fully into the promise of our liberal and liberating faith. It is with that understanding that we can change the world. Amen. May it be so. and blessed be.